Okay, so this is a lecture series, six-part lecture series on Judaism and the environment, 10 teachings on Judaism and environmentalism by Rabbi Lawrence Troster of Kesher Israel Congregation in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So what we're going to do tonight is a kind of introduction to all of this. And the document that I've given you is something I wrote more than 10 years ago when I was working at Green Faith, the interfaith environmental group based in New Jersey, where I was asked to sort of come up with what I considered to be the essential teachings of Judaism that could be connected to environmental values. And my goal in this class is to go through this, but talk about each one in detail. In the material you've been given, so there are 10, and each one has the idea expressed, explained with a source material referred to but not necessarily quoted. So during the lectures I hope to bring you the quotes on which it's based, as well as some of the regular environmental perspective that lies behind it. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going with this. So the first thing, and I want to ask you, when you see this question, what immediately comes to mind with the word environment?
Everything around us.
Everything around us. Anybody? Again, I try and just think of what immediately came to your mind.
Outside.
Outside, okay?
I was going to say air, ground, grass,
Air,
things that are growing.
Global warming.
Global warming, okay. You're a very sophisticated audience. Some people immediately come to mind something like this, right? And in fact, I once saw an ad for the Sierra Club, which showed a poor polar bear clinging to a piece of ice. And this was the draw to try and raise money. And the Sierra Club seems to be quite successful in doing that, since it's one of the wealthiest environmental organizations in the world. Okay? So for some people, scenes like this are what is the environment. Cute, wild animals. For some, it's the grandeur of things like the Grand Canyon, right? You think of the environment, you think of the incredible vistas that you may have seen in Alaska or in some kind of wilderness area or something that evokes in you this amazing sense of something that is not part of human life. Some people take the small as their inspiration of the environment. Birders are often very much involved in environmentalism. This is a hummingbird, close-up of a hummingbird. And people, it doesn't have to be a grand vista, it doesn't have to be exotic wild animals. People can find their attachment to the environment in the small, in the ordinary, in the day-to-day. This is one of my inspirations. As you know, I grew up in Toronto, and I spent many summers in Northern Ontario. And Northern Ontario has 100,000 lakes. And I went to summer camps there. And this is the Lake of Bays, one of the lakes that you would find there at sunset. And when I think back on some of my most intense spiritual experiences, they were in settings like this, either at the camp or on canoe trips. And there's many things that are deep, deep in my memory about getting up in the morning on a canoe trip, getting prepared for our next day, and going out on a lake that was like a mirror, perfectly calm, reflecting the entire sky. So that's one of my personal things when I thought of what is the environment for me. But the environment is also this. This is the site of a mountaintop removal in Appalachia, probably either West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky, where over 600 mountains have had their tops blown off for coal mining, because it's a lot easier, a lot more efficient, uses fewer employees than traditional mining methods of digging tunnels. And about 500 feet of the top of the mountain is blown off with dynamite. The debris is all pushed into neighboring valleys, and then the seams of coal are dug out and trucked out. Now, this causes permanent damage to the environment. The Appalachians are some of the oldest mountains in the world, and this will never be repaired. And they're very smart. They make sure that the mountains that are blown up are not visible from scenic highways. They leave it. And it also has devastating environmental effects on the communities that live in Appalachia. Their waters are poisoned, their streams are destroyed, and there's a real conflict going on there, or it's kind of died down a bit, but because coal is declining as a source of energy in this country in favor of natural gas, but that doesn't mean that natural gas is benign in its production. Here's another one. Newark, New Jersey has some of the highest percentage in square miles of Superfund sites in the United States. These are former industrial sites or dumps, post-production, and a lot of them are concentrated in a particular neighborhood in Newark called the Ironbound District. It's called that because it's fronted by two railways, and one of the boundaries of the Ironbound, which has always been an immigrant neighborhood, it was Portuguese for a while, and then Brazilians came in, and now it's a lot of Latino people, is the site of the Occidental Chemical Corporation, which produced Agent Orange for the Vietnam War. The plant was shut down in the 1980s. It was torn down, and there were hundreds and hundreds of barrels of dioxin, which is one of the most carcinogenic substances known to humankind, which were an essential part of Agent Orange, and this is the reason why so many Vietnam veterans got sick, was from the Agent Orange. And they buried it on the site, and they put a cap over it. That can never be changed. There's no way to get rid of dioxin. The best they can do is to take it to a toxic waste dump. So this site is permanent. The problem is just over the edge of the picture is the Passaic River, which is a tidal river, and thousands of tons of dioxin was dumped illegally by the company into the Passaic River, which swept it up 15 miles upstream. It was then covered by sediment, and in fact, this past year, the EPA finally began to develop a plan to have the river dredged. But if people have talked about, well, if you dredge it, you're just dredging it up. But they're going to get rid of it, maybe, and it's going to have to be taken to a toxic waste dump, which will probably be in one of the southern United States, and which have very low levels of environmental laws, and very often those waste dumps are next to poor communities or communities of color. So here's another part of our environment. This is the South Sea island of Tuvalu, which you may have heard of, you may not have heard of. Tuvalu is an area that was part and parcel, of course, where there was a lot of heavy fighting in the Second World War between the United States and Japan. Tuvalu has 11,000 people on it, and they've been there for 3,000 years. They have their own culture, and they will have to leave. The oceans have risen enough in the last 20 years. They don't have any more drinking water of their own. They can't grow their own food. Everything has to be imported. And no country will allow them as a nation to occupy a piece of territory. The most that New Zealand and Australia will do will allow them to apply as immigrants, as individuals and families. I only found out about Tuvalu a little over 10 years ago when I heard one of the former ambassadors to Tuvalu mentioned this, and I'd never known about it. And Tuvalu is not alone in being an island nation where this is going to happen. The Pacific Island nations have an association, and they meet every year. And one of their biggest topics is, so where are we going to move? These people will become what are called climate migrants or climate refugees, which there already are in the world. More than 5 years ago, the international aid agency CARE issued a report which they conservatively, in other words, they said this is a lowball estimate, that by 2050, 250 million people will be displaced by climate change. Biggest group will come from countries that are close to large river deltas, low-lying river deltas. Bangladesh is one of the biggest ones, which is already being affected. And so this too is our environment. This is also my environment, my family. And this is our environment. That's Kesher, Israel from Google Earth. Okay? So what do you learn about all these pictures? Similar to what some of you have said, that what is the environment? The environment is our planet. Our planet is our only home. This is a magnificent picture of the Earth from space. And here's a picture that's quite famous, taken on December 24th, 1968 by Apollo 8. Many of us remember that moment when Apollo 8 passed behind the moon and lost radio contact for a few minutes, and everybody held their breaths until they came out. This was the first picture of Earth taken from space, like this. And it had a big impact. Some people said it was one of the things that influenced the beginning of the creation of Earth Day in 1970. Well, here's another interesting picture, taken in 1990. Voyager 1, the famous space probe, left our solar system, but before it did, its last picture of Earth in 1990 was this. So this is the furthest picture of Earth that we have from space. That's our home, a little blue dot in the darkness. So, and this is taken by the Hubble telescope, and all those lights there, those aren't stars, those are galaxies. So the universe is vast, but we are part of this whole structure. And so we learn from this is that the environment is everywhere. We work, everywhere we live, we learn, we play, and we pray. There's nowhere which is not the environment. And it's not something that's out there. It's right here. Okay? And this should help us understand what it means to become an environmentalist. And I would say a Jewish environmentalist. The first thing that we have is scientific knowledge. The environmental movement began with science. The modern American environmental movement began with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring in the early 60s, where it was discovered that pesticides have an impact on animal life, specifically birds, and most specifically the bald eagle, which was going to become extinct in the lower 48 states because of DDT. Judaism is not against scientific knowledge. I can't say that it's always been that way. It's a little more complicated than that. But generally speaking, our tradition has looked at the scientific study of the natural world as a positive religious activity. And today, I would say, the vast majority of Jews see science as a critical source of truth in our world, whether it's for medicine or climate or other kinds of things. And we don't see this as being in conflict with our identity as Jews. We don't have in our tradition in the modern world, the kind of battles that are going on with certain religious groups in the world over science. The second thing that is important to being an environmentalist is long-term thinking. Environmentalism asks questions about what's not going to happen in the next election cycle, but what's going to happen 10 years, 20 years, half a century, 1,000 years from now. What is the connection between what we do now and what will happen in the future? And so that's why you see things like the CARE estimate of 2050. It's hard for most people to think beyond their own lifespan, and in some cases to even care. But we have to. And when you think about religious perspectives, there are, I don't know, a religious religion that doesn't have some kind of long-term thinking. And certainly the Jewish tradition does. We're always talking about l'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. That's not only about the past, but the future. We're always talking, what is the future of the Jewish community? Well, the future of the Jewish community is bound up with the future of humanity. And so long-term thinking is important, but it's also about morality. What we do now has a moral impact on future generations. So the example I will give you is the electricity we are using at this particular moment, because a certain percentage of it comes from fossil fuels, probably more than 50%, the carbon that is being produced right this moment will stay in the atmosphere for between 100 and 1,000 years, affecting our descendants and future generations. So long-term thinking is critical when it means to be an environmentalist, and that's not in conflict with the Jewish tradition. The third thing is the sense of interconnection. And this is not some kind of vague mystical idea. This is a scientific reality, that all things are interconnected. We, as I said, we're breathing in air and breathing out carbon dioxide. There's a constant flow of the cycles in the earth that are important for the maintenance of life. These are scientific facts, but they're also moral facts, that what we do in this place has an impact on the people of Tuvalu. The people of Tuvalu did not cause climate change, and yet they will suffer its results. And this is part and parcel of what is considered, and we'll go into this as one of the Jewish values, the notion of environmental justice, that there's been an unequal distribution of the risks and benefits from the carbon economy. Namely, that 20% of the world's population has consumed 80% of its resources and produced 80% of the greenhouse gases, and therefore derived the benefit from this, produced the greenhouse gases, and yet will not suffer proportionately its results, because the wealth that we have generated to some extent will protect us against the worst of this. We will not be completely protected, but let's face it, the United States has a lot of resources to mitigate and to build bulwarks against some of the worst impacts of climate change, and Tuvalu does not. So the sense of interconnection is a literal fact and a moral fact. And the moral fact, is one of our problems is this gap that we have between our actions and the results that they have. Traditional ethics was really developed at a time when all relationships were interpersonal and immediate in time and in space. I come to you and we contract a business arrangement, and if something fails, the moral nexus is right there, right? Now we can purchase something using the internet. We don't know where it's made unless we look at it. We don't have to deal with a human being in terms of sales, and we don't know what its environmental impact was on its manufacture. We don't know the labor conditions. There's this gap where we have no idea. All we know is that there's going to be a box that's going to come in the mail with what we ordered. So we have distanced ourselves, and many people have believe that this is an amoral act. It's not part of a moral relationship, but it is. It is. Mitch Thomashaw, who taught for many years at the graduate school at Antioch College, wrote a book called Ecological Identity, Becoming a Reflective Environmentalist. And what I would call environmental awareness, he calls ecological identity. And he points out the fact that it means that how people perceive themselves in reference to nature as living and breathing beings connected to the rhythms of the earth, the biogeochemical cycles, the grand and complex diversity of ecological systems. How do we actually personally understand that? And he points out again, you have to see the ecosystem as part of oneself. And he says, this knowledge is gained both through an understanding of scientific ecology, that's the facts, the scientific facts, but also the ability to observe and internalize the interconnections and interdependence of all living things. That's not the factual, that's the existential. How do we internalize these facts into how we are as people? That's the tough thing. How do you go from the facts to changing the behavior? This is what environmental educators call the holy grail of environmental education. You can teach people all kinds of stuff about the impact of what they're doing, but how does it change their behavior? Or how can it change their behavior? And so we're trying to get people to do that. And, it's the path to truth, justice, and wisdom. And many people are lined up for the 99-cent burgers. This is one of my favorite cartoons on the difficulty to get people to change. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about consumption. So one of the things that I do, and I have done for many years, is to be involved in what's called eco-theology, which is like regular theology, where I look at some of the classic categories of our relationship to God and various other important Jewish ideas like creation, revelation, and redemption, but I try to understand it, bringing into play everything I know about the environment. And the first person I read who was an eco-theologian was the late Thomas Berry, a Catholic thinker who wrote a critical work called The Dream of the Earth. And that was the first time. This was already after I had been involved in environmentalism for some years, and actually met Thomas Berry once very briefly. But that book blew me away, because Berry essentially said, we have to throw out, or at least for a while ignore, all our old stories and learn the new story of the universe and make that have a serious impact on our thinking in the world. And when environmentalism first began, as you will see, religions did not really jump in, but when they started to, they essentially all said, well, our religion is green and we don't have to change at all. And Berry said, no, you've got to go deeper than that. And so that's what eco-theology is about. And Mary Evelyn Tucker, who teaches at Yale, who was really, with her husband John Grimm, was responsible for the development of the whole academic field of religion and ecology, has basically said that religious traditions need to do three things. Retrieval, finding previously neglected or ignored material within traditional sources that may speak to a modern eco-theological perspective. Finding sources that were neglected or not really emphasized. Okay? Like in our tradition, the last chapters of the book of Job represent a very radical perspective, as you will see, on the relationship of human beings to the rest of creation. And some people in our tradition have gone to look at the Kabbalah or Hasidism or other kinds of sources that really haven't been connected in this particular way. The second one is reinterpretation, taking traditional sources, liturgy and rituals, and reinterpreting them in an environmental or ecological context, like taking the liturgy and saying, okay, here's the traditional meaning of it, but can I give it a new interpretation? Because that's the kind of thing that Judaism has done for a long time. The last one is the most radical. It's called Reconstruction, where you actually have to take traditional ideas and you have to completely rethink them and come to totally new ways of expressing them. And that's the one that a lot of religious traditions are just not prepared to do because it's too much. They would rather say, we don't have to change anything and we can still be green. That's not my road, but that's what you see in many places. Does anybody have any questions or reactions at this particular point? We'll take a moment to pause. Yeah, Maureen.
Our liturgy in many instances discusses preserving the land and taking care of the land and making sure that we don't destroy fields or crops historically, correct?
There is material like that, yes. But I'll give you an example. The second paragraph of the Shema talks about how, this is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 11, that if you follow the covenant, God will give you fertile land and rain. If you don't, God will cause drought. Now, in modern Judaism, a lot of people have looked at that and said, well, we don't believe that God does this anymore. We don't believe if there's a tsunami, God has brought this as a punishment for our sins or a drought. And so they've downplayed that. In fact, the Reconstruction movement even removed that paragraph or put an alternative for that. But you can now look at it in a different context, can't you? You can look at it and say that we do have an impact on the weather of this planet. And maybe it's not God actually doing it. We're doing it. But to think that we can't have an impact on the very weather systems of this planet, well, we are. So that's one way in which a very traditional text has been recast within an environmental context. And there are many other things that one can do with that sort of thing. The creation of the Tu B'Shvat Seder, for example. The Tu B'Shvat Seder was a very, very minor thing created by Kabbalists in the 16th century. Tu B'Shvat was a very minor kind of blip on the calendar. The modern Zionist movement made it into Jewish Arbor Day, but it was a result of the Jewish environmental movement, specifically the first Jewish environmental group in the United States, Shomrei Adamah. Ellen Bernstein wrote the first environmental Tu B'Shvat Seder, utilizing the Kabbalistic one as its basis, but recasting it as an environmental ritual. And Tu B'Shvat has become, for many Jews, the Jewish Earth Day. And many congregations have a Tu B'Shvat Seder, usually based on the Shomrei Adamah Seder. And so that is where that's really a reconstruction, because it really barely existed. Very few people even heard of it. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, we would, this is the time when we gave trees to J&F, and they would give us a bag of some of the fruits of Israel, and they'd give us this hard piece, the boxer, as it was called, and we didn't know what to do with it. We did not eat it. We used it like hockey pucks.
And a certificate for the tree.
Yes, exactly, and that was it, right?
Blue and white can.
Yeah, exactly, that was it. But we didn't do who knew what it was? But it's become an important part of the Jewish calendar now. And Sukkot has also been, in some ways, done that, in other ways as well. So this gets us into the history of the Jewish environmental movement, and if you'll take a look on on the 6th page. As I said, the history of the Jewish environmental movement is wrapped up with the history of the general religious environmental movement. In other words, you cannot talk really about a Jewish response to the environment before 1970s. I'm separating off what was going on in the state of Israel. Israel had a very vigorous secular, and still does, secular environmental movement and a conservation movement. And I want to make a distinction here. The earlier movement in the United States and in many places in the world was the conservation movement, which started in the 19th century and is connected in the United States with people like Thoreau and John Muir and Aldo Leopold, who sought the idea that we should conserve wild spaces. So the whole development of the national parks under Teddy Roosevelt was as a direct result of the conservation movement, of which Roosevelt was part of, and his relationship with John Muir, one of the most important figures in the history of the American conservationist movement. The modern environmental movement starts with Rachel Carson, because what comes out of Rachel Carson's book is finally a debate about things like air pollution, clean water, the protection of species, and in fact it's during the Nixon administration that all of the legislation, the most important environmental legislation that is done in the United States, such as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the creation of the EPA, that's all done under the Nixon administration because of pressure from both Democrats and Republicans. It was not seen as a partisan issue at the time. And so the American environmental movement really gets going in the 1960s and 70s as a secular movement primarily connected with laws, regulations, and policy. The religious element comes in later. And part of it comes as a result of an article in 1967 called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis by a historian named Lynn White Jr., which appears in the journal Science. And White made the claim that it was Western religion, he was mostly attacking Christianity, that was responsible for the modern environmental crisis, that its attitude towards the natural world had degraded the sacred nature of the natural world and was responsible for our attitudes in our industrial exploitation. Now, White was wrong both, and then it also goes back to the Hebrew Bible, to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, when people are given dominion, as the old translations say, over the other life on earth. Lynn was wrong on two things. First of all, he was picking just a verse out of its context, out of the Bible. He didn't know biblical text, and he didn't also know the history of the interpretation of that verse in Western religion. And though that verse was never taken in Judaism and in Christianity as the right to completely exploit and despoil creation. The first time it was ever sort of used in that context, in fact, was the Royal Society in England in the 17th century. But the thing that White did was he convinced people that religious traditions matter in our attitudes towards the natural world. And he sparked a debate. And Christian and Jewish theologians felt they had to respond. And so some of the first Jewish writings on the environment are a response to Lynn White. The earliest that I ever saw was Rabbi Everett Gendler wrote a piece on Judaism and the environment in 1968. But Norman Lamb, who was the president of Yeshiva University, wrote something in the early 70s. You begin to see Jewish religious writing trying to, it's apologetic writing. In other words, it's trying to answer White and say, no, Judaism is not antithetical to the environmental movement because Earth Day started in 1970. So by the mid-1980s, you begin to see the development of religious responses. And one of the most important interfaith responses was the Assisi Declaration. This was engineered by the Worldwide Fund for Nature and Pope John Paul II, where at Assisi, where St. Francis, of course, came from, and St. Francis is the patron saint of the environment for Catholics and other Christians, they got leaders of half a dozen world religions to make proclamations declaring that their tradition supports environmental action, including a Jewish leader. And then some other traditions who hadn't been invited to the original meeting also sort of, I mean, it's a written document, you can read it. And in 1987, the United Nations Environment Program in New York created the Environmental Sabbath program, which was designed for Christian and Jewish congregations to, on the first Sabbath of June, to do some kind of program on that Sabbath. And they had whole packets of information and prayers and other things that one could do, because World Environment Day is in the beginning of June. And so that was something that was done. And at the United Nations in New York, there was created an interfaith council on the environment as a volunteer group within UNEP in New York. So in 1988, Shomrei Adamah was the first Jewish organization that was devoted to environmental action. And they came up, it was never a large organization, but there were chapters of it around the country. They came up with a lot of interesting materials and resources. They partnered with Hadassah to have a book of resources on environmental activities. They created the Tu B'Shvat Seder, and for several years, and it was all started by Ellen Bernstein, who is really the mother of the Jewish environmental movement. I mean, Rabbi Everett Gendler is one of the fathers of the Jewish environmental movement. Ellen Bernstein is certainly the mother. What happened was that in 1990, a group of prominent American scientists, headed up by Carl Sagan and Stephen Jay Gould, the biologist, wrote a letter to the main religious denominations in the United States, begging them for help on climate change, 1990, saying that we were at a critical point and they needed their help in activating the religious communities to help them do something about this. As a result of this letter, the Pew Fund created what was called the a national interfaith group on the environment. And what they did was they held a series of meetings in Washington for particular religious denominations. So there was a Catholic conference, there was a mainline Protestant conference, there was a conference for evangelicals, and there was one for the Jewish community. It was called the Consultation on the Environment and Jewish Life. And it was done in conjunction with what was then called NACRAC, and is the Jewish Policy Organization, National Jewish Policy Organization. And that meeting in Washington was right around the time that Bill Clinton began to run for president. And one of the people who came to that meeting was then Senator Al Gore, who had just published his first book on this, Earth in the Balance. And I was at that meeting. And that really was anybody who'd been involved with the Jewish environmental movement, which I'd already been involved since mid-'80s, came to that meeting. And out of that meeting was eventually created the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life, which was the Jewish group of this national partnership, okay? And at the same time, a little later that year, was the United Nations Conference on the Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. And this is the first time there was a plan for global, national, and local action on issues of environmental degradation. It was called Agenda 21. And there was an important moral element to that. Now, because of the Rio Conference, a number of religious organizations started in the early 90s, including what was called the Partners for Environmental Equality in New Jersey, or PEQ, which later became known as Green Faith, but also the earliest Christian environmental group, Earth Ministry in Seattle, was founded in the early 90s. So this was the beginning, really, of a significant organized effort in the religious communities to organize their communities, to green their facilities, to have them become advocates for environmental change. And it all happened in the early 90s. Now, in the early days of COGIL, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York was one of the most important partners with them. And they held a consultation in Pawling, New York in 1994, which I was at. And in the same year, there was the founding of the Teva Learning Center by the Isabella Friedman Jewish Retreat Center in Surprise Lake Camp. Now, for many years, since that point until they were absorbed by Hazon, the Teva Learning Center became the premier Jewish ground for training Jewish environmental educators. And it was a model for other religious groups as well. And many of the people who came through Teva then founded other kinds of Jewish groups. And it really was one of the most important and influential groups that existed in terms of the Jewish environmental movement. In the late 1990s, you had at Harvard a series of conferences. This was headed up by Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, on different religious groups and the environment. Each conference was a particular religion. So there was one on Judaism and the natural world at Harvard. And each of these conferences produced a book. So there are now a whole bunch of books, Judaism and Ecology, Christianity and Ecology, Islam, Confucianism, Buddhism, Jainism, indigenous religions, Hinduism. And this really was the thing that created the academic discipline of religion and ecology. The same year, there was a special retreat for rabbis. And in Israel, the Heschel Center for Environmental Learning and Leadership was established. This was the first time that an environmental group in Israel that was really established from a spiritual perspective. And the Heschel Learning Center continues to this day as a place of creating resources and training from a Jewish perspective on the environment. One of the most important organizations, which is now the largest Jewish environmental organization, is Hazon, and that started in 2000. There was also a program called Adamah, and Adamah was a summer internship for university-age people to come and work on a Jewish organic farm for several months. And this farm was at the Isabella Friedman Jewish Retreat Center. One of the people who came out of Teva created something called the Jewish Farm School outside of Baltimore in 2006. And in 2008 was created a summer camp, which is all about integrating Jewish environmental values, taking all of the work that was done by Teva and putting it into a summer camp experience. And it's called Eden Village, and it's up on the Hudson, north of New York City. Yeah.
They have a West Coast camp. This summer they're starting a West Coast.
Yeah, they were so successful. They got a major grant from a Jewish foundation, and they expected to grow slowly, and they just boomed. And so they're starting a West Coast version of it.
I don't know if I remember correctly, but I think Joyce and Glenn Brown's daughter worked at the Jewish Farm School. It was part of the educational. I know she has a connection with it because she is in the Jewish community outside of Baltimore. So.
Well, the founder of that came out of the Teva Center, okay? The Teva Learning Center. So there's been all of this that's, look, the movement has had its ups and downs. It's had its funding problems. COGIL virtually disappeared at one point. They're trying to revive it in many ways. Funding for any religious environmental movement has been extremely difficult through the years, even some of the most successful ones. The largest national interfaith environmental group is called the IPL, which means Interfaith Power and Light. It started as an Episcopalian project in San Francisco and California, but then became a national interfaith group with chapters in about 40 different states, including Pennsylvania. And that group, there were times when they virtually couldn't operate. And so it's been a struggle, and part of the problem sometimes is that the foundations that give money to religious groups don't understand the connection between religion and environment, and foundations that give money to environmental groups don't understand the connection between religion and environment. So it's been a struggle. But I think that one of the things that Ecological did, I don't know why I blanked on it, but the organization that Ecological was part of the subgroup was called the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, which still exists, but again has really faded from the scene as a significant national force. But Ecological really, and Shomer Adama, helped to put the environment on the Jewish agenda. And many congregations have gone through greening processes or have built new buildings with green building techniques. So it's something that has had an impact. It's not had the impact that we all hoped it would back in the early 90s, but it has had the impact. And there are a lot of young Jews, and this has been true for the last 20 years or more, that are deeply connected to secular environmentalism and see it as an expression of their Jewish identity, but are not connected to the Jewish community. And one of the things that Ecological was trying to do was to bring together environmentalists who were Jewish with rabbis and Jewish academics and scientists who were Jewish and bring them all together. And on a broader scale, get Jews who were interested in environmentalism, but maybe were not connected with the Jewish community, to connect with the Jewish community. And again, that's something that's not so easy to do. Anybody have any other questions or comments at this point? Yes, Maury.
There's a comment that Adam Berman, who was Isabel Freeman, is now on the West Coast, and he has an organization called Urban Adama.
Right.
And what he does is take people who are interested in environmentalism and are leaders in their community who don't have much of a Jewish connection, and brings them into the Urban Adama, and they're already leaders, and then they're part of this, and it's been very successful.
Yeah, and Adam Berman is one of the really important figures in the Jewish environmental movement, because he founded Adama, and then when he left after many years, he created this Urban Adama. He is an important person in all of this. One of the big, there was an uptick of a lot of activity a couple years ago because of the Pope's encyclical and the climate change thing in Paris. It's difficult to say what will happen over the next few years, but I think that one of the reasons why I found not just the Jewish environmental world, but the interfaith environmental world to be so powerful is that this was an area where you could, I remember the early, Ecological had a yearly conference, and we got Jews from all over the place, all different stripes, from Orthodox to completely secular. And it was one of the most creative gatherings and one of the most diverse gatherings you found in the entire Jewish community. And likewise, in an interfaith connection, you're bringing people together of all kinds of different faiths who maybe have very different perspectives on things. But this is one area where there's no fighting over. It's not a hot button issue between faiths for the most part. And everybody can come at it from their own perspective and their own language. So yes, not all traditions are ready to do the kind of radical eco-theology of the kind that I'm interested in. But there's a lot of ways in which every community can do something about it. And it depends on the community. And, in the United States, it really depends on also if it's an immigrant community and all kinds of factors. But there are Christians of every kind, Jews of every kind. Muslims have gotten involved a lot more. Not so much the Hindu community, but that's changing. The American Buddhist community has been very active. And the Baha'i community is probably one of the most active religious groups in the world. in environmental issues. It's one of their central ideas. Any other questions at this point? Yeah.
Well, with the environmental movement, with all this interfaith, the interfaith and the groups that we have, is there any conflict that they find as far as big business? I mean, is there, even in Washington, do we have a voice? Is there a voice with all the interfaith movement to let them know that, and is there any conflict between big business and us? We're trying to enlighten everybody to change what we do.
It really depends on which business.
Well,
In other words, the carbon industries are still very resistant
right.
to doing this. They created a disinformation campaign, like Big Tobacco did, about climate change for many years, which is why there are sectors of the United States that still don't believe that it exists. We're the only country really where that happens. But there are many businesses that recognize that climate change is a serious issue, will be a serious dent on their activities, and there is the sustainable energy market is just going through the roof, and green building, for example, over the last 20 years has become central to the building and construction industry, and there's all kinds of industries that have popped up to provide for sustainable products. The organic food market, for example, is enormous compared to what it was 25 years ago. So people often pose it's environment versus jobs, environment versus business. That's a kind of false dichotomy. It really depends on what business. The carbon extraction companies have a lot of money invested in infrastructure. So for them, it's a big deal to shift. But the shift is coming, whether they like it or not. It's only a question of how fast can it be done.
That's because all that costs money. As far as a green building, you have to be educated as to how, you just don't say, I'm going to build a green building.
No, but most architects are now certified to design green buildings. There are many contractors are certified to create green buildings. There's there's been a standard that was created years ago called the LEED standard. There's a whole area there that, is amazing when you look into it, how big it is.
And so is that due to all the environmental movement?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
hand in hand.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And sometimes politicians listen to religious groups on this, especially if they come in an interfaith manner. They're more likely to listen if everybody's banding together than if they come individually.
Just that
In
curiosity.
new buildings, it's cost effective. At the university, all the new buildings at the university and also at the hospital are building environmentally.
Yeah, they're all being built to LEED standards.
Right.
Absolutely. I think New Jersey, for example, even passed a law some years ago requiring new public buildings to be part of the LEED standard. Which it saves enormous amounts. The problem used to be that to build what's called a LEED standard building cost you at least 30% more than conventional building, but on the long term saved you an enormous amount in terms of energy efficiency and things. That cost difference has come way, way down. It's not that big anymore. Okay? All right. I think this is a good place to stop. Next week we'll look at the first couple of ideas. You'll notice, I just want to point out that the first three principles, the first three teachings are theological. Principles 4 and 5 are spiritual. And 6, 7, 8, and 9 are very particular in terms of actions and issues. And the last one goes back to a kind of theological, the concept of tikkun olam. So we will look at the first two next week, and we will, by the end of the 6 week, cover all of them. Okay?
Did you say that we should not have this on?
Well, if you're going to bring them back,
Okay.
take them home. If you think you won't, give them back to me.
Okay.